L'honorable vice-première ministre.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to table, in both official languages, the government's fall economic statement, supporting Canadians and fighting COVID-19. À l'heure actuelle,
COVID-19 is surging across Canada right now. We know the winter ahead will be hard. For far too many families, it will be a winter of loneliness and grief. But we also know that spring will follow winter. The message I would like to share with Canadians today is that we will get through this. We are a resilient people. We are a resourceful people, and we have a plan. We know what we must do to get through the dark months ahead. And we know what we must do to bring our economy roaring back once this pandemic is beaten. Mr. Speaker, every life lost to COVID-19 is one life too many. So we need to redouble our public health efforts until the virus is crushed. We do not have the luxury of fatigue. And we now have arrows in our quiver.
Prepared today than we were last spring. Canadians and Canadian businesses now have access to a comprehensive package of federal support measures to help them weather shutdowns ordered by public health authorities. We know how to keep most of our economy, from manufacturing to mining to jobs that can be done remotely, operating safely, even while the virus is still circulating in our communities. We have learned how to keep many of our children in school. Our ability to treat the disease has evolved. As of late November, more than 5.5 million Canadians had downloaded the COVID Alert app. We have the PPE and ventilators we need. We have learned to wear masks, to keep 2 meters apart, and to wash our hands. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, safe, effective, and plentiful vaccines are on the way. We don't know precisely when this pandemic will end, but we do know that it will end. This fall economic statement outlines the Government of Canada's measures to fight and defeat COVID-19, to support Canadians through this crisis, and to rebuild Canada's economy once the virus is beaten. We will do whatever it takes to help Canadians stay healthy, safe, and solvent. We will invest in every necessary public health measure, and we will support Canadian families and Canadian businesses in a deliberate, prudent, and effective way. Nous savons que les Canadiens.
We understand the sacrifices that have been made and are still being made by Canadians right now. Many small business owners have shut their doors. Workers are still without jobs. Parents have put careers on hold to keep their families healthy and safe. Young children diligently wear masks for hours every day in school, knowing They are helping to protect their grandparents. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are doing their part. It's only right that we, in this House, do ours by ensuring the economy that comes after this pandemic is more innovative, inclusive, and resilient than the one that preceded it. From the onset of COVID-19, our government has done everything in our power to combat the virus and mitigate its harm using every tool available.
8 out of every $10 spent in Canada to fight the virus and support Canadians has been spent by the federal government. To date, the government has procured more than 2 billion pieces of PPE, and we have assembled a comprehensive, world-leading portfolio of vaccines. The government has invested more than $1 billion in vaccine agreements, securing a domestic supply of up to 429 million doses of 7 promising vaccines, more than 10 doses for every Canadian. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Canada has secured the most diverse and extensive vaccine portfolio of any country in the world. Every Canadian can rest assured that a safe and effective vaccine will be available to them free of charge. The battle against COVID-19 has proceeded on many fronts. We have invested in healthcare, increased testing and tracing, and directly supported provinces and territories as they fight the virus. This has been a Team Canada effort. L'aide totale accordée.
Total support so far includes $322 billion in direct measures to fight the virus and help people, and $85 billion in tax and duty deferrals. Mr. Speaker, this is the largest economic relief package for our country since the Second World War. Last spring, the Canadian Armed Forces did heroic work in our long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec, and they helped save Canadian seniors' lives. In the summer, we announced more than $4 billion so provinces and territories could build up their testing and contact tracing capacity, part of our $19.9 billion Safe Restart package. To help stop the spread of the virus in vulnerable communities, we worked with cities and communities to ensure that voluntary self-isolation sites would be available as an alternative to crowded housing. Alongside these essential health measures, we've introduced robust economic programs to help people, businesses, and organizations of all sizes to survive this pandemic. Together, these supports form a comprehensive safety net, which will be in place until the summer of 2021.
Emergency Response Benefit, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, and the Canada Emergency Business Account were quickly developed and rolled out so that people could pay their rent and mortgages and feed their families while doing their part to defeat the virus by staying home. From March through October, the CERB alone supported 8.9 million Canadians. Seniors received a special old age security top-up of $300, And qualifying Canadians with disabilities have received additional support worth up to $600. In August, the government announced the Canada Recovery Benefit, the Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit, the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit, and enhanced employment insurance. Each will be in place through the fall of 2021. This safety net is providing essential security to millions of Canadians. This month, the government launched new measures for businesses with a new commercial rent subsidy paid directly to businesses who this week will begin receiving support for up to 65% of their rent or mortgage interest, retroactive to September 27th. Businesses will also begin receiving new lockdown support of an additional 25% of rent or mortgage interest, where a shutdown is required by public health order. This means qualifying businesses in lockdown can have up to 90% of their rent covered. We are extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy through to June of 2021. More than 3.9 million Canadian jobs have been protected by this program alone. Mr. Speaker, in December, Canadian businesses will be able to apply for a top-up to the Canada Emergency Business Account Loan and Grant Program. Already, more than 780,000 small businesses across the country have taken advantage of the $40,000 CEBA loan, of which $10,000 is forgivable. The top-up is an additional $20,000 loan, of which half will be forgivable. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, we know that small businesses are the heart of our communities and the engine of our economy. Small businesses are the foundation of Canada's middle class. And we know this crisis is hitting family businesses particularly hard, imperiling in a few months the work of a lifetime and often of generations. That's why it is so important to support our small businesses and the middle-class families who have built them. Mr. Speaker, these measures provide economic certainty to Canadians in a turbulent and uncertain time. They will help get us through the winter. And these measures are targeted and flexible. They are most generous to those in greatest need. They are an essential complement to our healthcare response. These measures allow people and businesses to do the right thing, knowing they don't have to choose between public health and putting food on the table. Our commitment to employee sick leave and to supporting businesses where local shutdowns are ordered are examples of this approach. With the second wave upon us with full virulence, we are taking additional measures to help Canadians and Canadian businesses get through to the other side, to get through solvent and intact. We are providing $1 billion for a safe, long-term care fund for the provinces and territories, making fresh investments in PPE, and preparing for the largest vaccination mobilization in Canada's history. We are providing new resources to help improve ventilation in our public buildings, to make them safer, and to help workers and businesses we are raising the wage subsidy back to a maximum of 75%, recognizing that the earliest months of the year are the toughest for many businesses, and now more than ever.
Nous savons.
We know that businesses in tourism, hospitality, travel, arts, and culture have been particularly hard hit. So, we are creating a new stream of support for those businesses that need it the most. A credit availability program with 100% government-backed loan support and favorable terms for businesses that have lost revenue as people stay home to fight the spread of the virus.
This is the most severe challenge our country has faced since the Second World War. It is our most severe economic shock since the Great Depression, and our most severe public health crisis since the Spanish flu a century ago. Canadians should know that their federal government will be there to help them get through it, come what may. Today, I have spoken about the nature of the threat we face and the remedies we have provided. The fight against COVID-19 continues. But there is now light at the end of the tunnel. After winter comes spring. The seeds we have sown and will continue to plant in the weeks and months ahead to protect Canadians' health and save our jobs and businesses will help us come roaring back from the coronavirus recession. This careful husbandry will prevent the long-term economic scarring that would otherwise delay and weaken our post-pandemic recovery. Mr. Speaker, I'm the daughter of an Alberta farmer. Canada's farmers spend the winter fixing their tractors, combines, and seed drills, and stocking up on supplies. While the ground is frozen, they get ready for seeding when the earth thaws. Like all those great Canadian farmers, the work we do today will stand us in good stead in the spring. When the virus is under control and our economy is ready for new growth, we will deploy an ambitious stimulus package to jumpstart our recovery, spending roughly 3 to 4% of GDP over 3 years. Our government will make carefully judged, targeted, and meaningful investments to create jobs and boost growth. Notre plan de relance.
Our stimulus will be designed, first and foremost, to provide the fiscal support the Canadian economy needs to operate at its full capacity and to stop COVID-19 from doing long-term damage to our economic potential. Key to this plan will be smart, time-limited investments that can act fast while also making a long-run contribution to our future shared prosperity, our quality of life, our competitiveness, and our green transformation.
Will include investments that deliver on our commitment to create 1 million jobs and restore employment to pre-pandemic levels, as well as to unleash some of the Canadian economy's preloaded stimulus, the additional savings that have accumulated in the bank accounts of some Canadians and on the balance sheets of some businesses. Our growth plan will foster economic rebirth in the short term and strengthen this country's competitiveness in the long run. Today, we are presenting a down payment on this plan. These are measures we can begin safely taking now. They include investments in the green economy and job training, particularly for youth and care providers. health and social infrastructure. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, we know that Canada's future competitiveness depends on our ability to take advantage of the net zero green economy. Our growth plan must continue to advance our progress on climate action and promote a clean economy. We will plant 2 billion trees over the next 10 years, provide 700,000 grants to help homeowners make energy-efficient retrofits, and build zero-emission vehicle charging stations across the country.
Ces mesures favorisent les
These measures will encourage consumer spending and investment while greening our economy and creating well-paying jobs.
Mr. Speaker, this is a recession like no other we have faced. Women, young people, new Canadians, Black and racialized Canadians have been disproportionately hurt by the COVID-19 recession. They are, after all, the Canadians who are most likely to work in some of our hardest hit industries, including care, hospitality, and retail. And we know that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples are also disproportionately affected by this pandemic. Our growth plan will be designed with this particular damage in mind and will seek to heal it. This unique recession demands a unique response. COVID-19 has exposed and exacerbated the systemic barriers faced by Black entrepreneurs and owners of small and medium-sized businesses in Canada. So, the government, in partnership with Canadian financial institutions, has announced an investment of up to $221 million, including up to $93 million from the Government of Canada over the next 4 years, to launch this country's first Black entrepreneurship program. There is an unacceptable gap in infrastructure in Indigenous communities. So our government proposes to invest $1.5 billion beginning in 2020-2021 to speed up the lifting of all long-term drinking water advisories in First Nation communities. COVID-19 has been especially hard for young children and their families. We know that many middle-class families are really struggling. So to provide immediate relief for families with young children, our government proposes to introduce temporary additional support totaling up to $1,200 in 2021 for each child under the age of 6 for low and middle income families who are entitled to the Canada Child Benefit. Mr. Speaker, we know that COVID-19 is rolling back many of the gains Canadian women have fought for and won in my lifetime. That is why today, as part of our commitment to an action plan for women in the economy, we are laying the foundation for a Canada-wide early learning and child care system. Just as Saskatchewan once showed Canada the way on healthcare, and British Columbia showed Canada the way on pollution pricing, Quebec can show us all the way on childcare. I say this both as a working mother and as a finance minister. Canada will not be truly competitive until all Canadian women have access to the affordable childcare we need to support our participation in our country's workforce.
Bravo.
C'est un programme.
This is a feminist agenda, Mr. Speaker, and I say that proudly. It's also an agenda that makes sound business sense and is supported by many of Canada's corporate leaders, people who have witnessed firsthand the toll this crisis has taken on women, their families, and their children. We can only all do better when every one of us is contributing to our full potential.
As we build back, we have it within our reach to build back better. Tackling challenges that hold us all back. Homelessness, systemic racism, the unfinished and essential work of reconciliation. Economic downturns are always especially hard on young people. The COVID-19 recession is particularly damaging in this regard because of its impact on the service sector, in which many students work. Among other steps, the government proposes to reduce student debt by eliminating interest on the federal portion of the Canada Student Loans and Canada Apprentice Loans for 2021-2022. I remember vividly struggling with my own student loans, and I am glad to help relieve our young people who are swimming so hard against the COVID-19 current of this additional burden. In the coming months, we will work with Canadians and consult broadly to design the growth plan that will guide our strong fiscal position, allowing our government to take decisive action to help people and businesses weather the storm. And that action has helped so much. To date, Canada has recovered almost 80% of the more than 3 million jobs lost at the outset of the pandemic. Compare that to the United States, which has recovered just over half. But there is still a lot of hard slogging ahead. First, we must defeat the virus. Only then, when the threat of lockdowns and resurgence is past, will our economy be ready for a return to full, stable, long-term growth. Canadians understand that this crisis demands targeted, time-limited support to keep people and businesses afloat and to build our way out of the COVID-19 recession. The support and investments outlined in this plan, including our stimulus, will foster a resilient and inclusive recovery. Fiscal guardrails will help us establish when the stimulus will be wound down. The government will track progress against several related indicators, recognizing that no one data point is a perfect representation of the health of the economy. These indicators include the employment rate, total hours worked, and the level of unemployment in the economy. These data-driven triggers will tell us when the job of building back from the COVID-19 recession is accomplished, and we can bring one-off stimulus spending to an end. When the economy has recovered, the time-limited stimulus will be withdrawn, and Canada will resume its long-standing, prudent, and responsible fiscal path based on a long-term fiscal anchor, which we will outline when the economy is more stable. Mais ne vous trompez pas.
But make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, as we've learned from previous recessions, the risk of providing too little support now outweighs that of providing too much. We will not repeat the mistakes of the years following the Great Recession of 2008. In this fall economic statement, we are being transparent about the continuing uncertainty. We are planning and preparing for all eventualities. The rate of infection, the severity of shutdowns, the deployment of a safe and effective vaccine, all of these are variables in our economic outlook and our path to recovery.
La reprise. Mais, comme le montre,
But as our fiscal plan shows, Mr. Speaker, brighter days are ahead. And we can afford the investment we have to make to reach them. Canada entered this pandemic with the strongest fiscal position of any G7 country. We retain that position today. Federal debt servicing costs relative to the size of our economy remain at a 100-year low. And we are locking in those low costs by issuing more debt into longer-term instruments at these historically low rates.
les Canadiens veulent un système.
Canadians want a fair tax system where everyone pays their fair share, so the government has the resources it needs to invest in people and keep our economy strong. That is why we're moving ahead with implementing GST, HST on multinational web giants.
Et à limiter.
And we are also limiting stock option deductions in the largest companies. And if necessary, Canada will act unilaterally to apply a tax on large multinational digital corporations so that they pay their fair share just like any other company operating in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, our growth plan is far-reaching and transformative. But does this mean that the worst of the COVID-19 crisis is past? Sadly, it does not. Indeed, our country's most difficult days may come in the weeks and months immediately ahead. Hospitalizations are on the rise, and the virus continues to take a terrible toll, particularly on our elders. That is why we must redouble our public health efforts, obey public health instructions, physically distance, wear masks when in public, avoid social gatherings, and wash our hands. We must all do this, Mr. Speaker. We can save lives. We are here. This safety net is there now so that people can make the right decisions to protect our health. If we do the right things, if we hunker down and heed public health advice for these last remaining months, we will also be doing the right thing for our economy. And we will bring closer the day when every Canadian can get back to normal life. Most importantly, we will greatly lessen the mortal toll of this disease. Mr. Speaker, after nearly 10 months of the pandemic, we are all tired. But we also know that vaccines and a better day are coming. To get to that day, we must first help each other get through the winter. Our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through hard winters too. In times of war and depression, on frozen prairie homesteads, and in windswept fishing villages in Atlantic Canada, all across our vast country. The living survivors of those days, now our most vulnerable elders, are counting on us to buckle down for another few months. We can do this, Mr. Speaker. We must do this, Mr. Speaker. And we will do this, Mr. Speaker. Canadians have faced tough winters before, and we have always emerged stronger. We will this time, too. Thank you. Merci.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadians want their lives back. And they were expecting they'd hear news today that the government had fixed its failures that mean that Canada will be the back of the pack to receive the pandemic relief in the form of a vaccine that will give them their lives back. With the highest unemployment, other than Italy and all of the G7, they were expecting a plan for paychecks. Instead, they got a plan for more credit card debts. $400 billion will be added to our national credit card this year, 8 times bigger than the previous all-time national average. While Conservatives supported the CERB, the small business loans, the wage subsidies, those account for less than half of that record-smashing deficit. In fact, we've gone from a debt to GDP ratio of 30% to 56%. Now, within view of the default levels that we hit in the 1990s when Liberals were forced to slash health care to deal with the massive debt crisis that existed at that time. We are not at the cliff or even on the edge of the cliff, but we can now see the cliff, and this government is running towards it as quickly as humanly possible. The biggest deficit by far in all of the G20. They've spent the most to achieve the least. With all that spending, we're going to be the back of the pack on vaccinations. We have the second highest unemployment in the G7, and we couldn't get rapid testing approved and timed to get Canadians safely back to their lives. The minister has said that she would impose, quote, limits on our debt to avoid the brutal constraints of the marketplace. Will she tell us today, when speaking of the debt, what exactly are those limits? Thank you.
Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite touched on a lot of issues, ranging from vaccines to support on businesses to debt, deficits, and fiscal anchors. So I'm going to try to touch on most of those. Let me start with vaccines, Mr. Speaker, and let me say something that it is very important for Canadians to appreciate, because this is a key element in building the confidence we all need to have in our economic recovery. Canada has the most expansive portfolio of vaccines of any country in the world. 10 doses for every Canadian. And Mr. Speaker, we have, like a smart farmer, a smart investor, hedged our bets. There are 7 different vaccines in our portfolio. 4 of those vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson, are already submitting data on a rolling basis to Health Canada regulators. That, Mr. Speaker, can, should, and will provide a great deal of confidence to Canadians. And Mr. Speaker, let me quote Moderna's chairman, who, by the way, came to Canada first as a refugee child. He said that Canada is near the front of the line to receive 20 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine from Moderna. And I'm quoting him. The people who are willing to move early on with even less proof of the efficacy have assured the amount of supply they were willing to sign up to. In the case of Canada, that number is about 20 million doses. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. 20 million doses of a single vaccine. And there are 38 million Canadians. Now, I'm going to continue quoting Nubar Afeyan. He says, the government of Canada, like others, has also reserved the ability to increase that amount, and those discussions are ongoing. So, Mr. Speaker, and this is very important in terms of building the essential confidence in each other and in our economy. We have an extensive vaccine portfolio, and this is going to make a world of difference. Mr. Speaker, let me just speak briefly about the issue of debt and deficits, and I'll say two things. It's important for Canadians to appreciate that the interest charges on our debt that we are paying right now are the lowest in a century. And the government is acting prudently to push out the maturity of that debt so that we can lock in today's low interest rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments.
L'honorable député de la...
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID crisis is a health crisis. Healthcare is a provincial responsibility. It's Quebec's responsibility. Provinces have been hit so hard by this crisis. In fact, in Quebec, we need $3 billion more to deal with this health crisis. The federal government has cut health transfers year after year after year. Currently, we need 22% in order to help provinces. Provinces and Quebec have asked for over $20 billion to get the federal government to 35%. And that's without taking COVID into account. In this economic statement, we hear a plan for economic recovery and yet nothing for health transfers. This is the number one thing that Quebec and the provinces want. The government is ignoring what the provinces are experiencing and what they want. That's my first point. Second point, well, if you want a recovery plan, first and foremost, you need a vaccination plan. We're told that many vaccines have been bought. Yes, that's great. The government was panicking and they went and bought vaccines left, right, and center. Well, that wasn't really the best way to go about it. We need a plan with details, with dates, with numbers. How many doses will we receive? Who will be vaccinated first? Which provinces will be considered priority provinces due to the situation of COVID and contagiousness in those provinces? What parameters and indicators will be used to vaccinate and to deploy vaccines to the provinces, to Quebec? We haven't heard anything. We have no details. Mr. Speaker, the government is not being serious. Why is the government not taking tangible, real action to prepare a vaccination plan for Quebecers and Canadians? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his question. First, I would like to cover the federal government's assistance and support to provinces and territories, which is historic. Through our Safe Restart Agreement, we set aside $19.9 billion for provinces and territories. We added a further $2 billion for the safe restart of our schools. We are continuing to invest with the $1 billion I invested today for safe long-term care for provinces and territories. We are here for Canadians. And I would like to add something. I hope my colleague will hear me. We are here for all Quebecers. We are here for Quebec's businesses. 8 in every $10 spent on crisis management since the beginning of the crisis have been spent by the federal government. 25% of Quebecers have received, in fact, the Serbs. So many Quebecers were helped by our benefits. We have saved lives, we have saved families, and we continue to help through the wage subsidy. We know that the winter will be difficult. That's why we decided to increase the emergency wage subsidy back up to 75% as the maximum amount. That's substantial, Mr. Speaker. Now, as for vaccines, Quebecers should be proud of Mr. Noubar Afayette. He is a Quebecer. His family still lives in Quebec. Canada welcomes refugees with open arms, and that is why the world has that vaccine. That's what we heard on Radio-Canada yesterday. He said countries who are ready to act quickly without full proof of efficacy are able to ensure for their countries several doses, securing doses. And it's so true, Mr. Speaker. We will have 20 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Nous allons prendre 1 minute pour une dernière question, une question de 30 secondes, et nous espérons une réponse de 30 secondes aussi. The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Canadians are struggling to put food on the table, struggling to keep a roof over their head. But when they read the economic update, what they will see is austerity is coming, Mr. Speaker. Now, we know during this pandemic so far, we've seen $53 billion wealth going to Canada's billionaires. But in this document, we see no wealth tax, we see no excess profits tax. The web giants are not obliged to pay $1 of corporate tax. So for the pandemic and for the rebuilding, the question is very simple. Why does this government continue to refuse to have Canada's billionaires pay their fair share?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister in 30 seconds or less, please.
Mr. Speaker, I'm accustomed in this House to face many accusations, but I didn't expect to be accused of a policy of austerity. When it comes to taxing the web giants, let me say this. We are clear on our intent to levy the GST, HST equally on all service providers in Canada. That's fair. And I know Canadians believe in fairness, and we also made very clear that while we much prefer working inside the OECD to have a multilateral approach to taxing corporate revenues of multinationals, if that job is not done, Canada will act unilaterally, and in January 2022, we will impose our own tax because that is fair too.
Debate, reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance has proven their government has no plan. Without a plan for vaccines, there can be no long-term plan for our economy. Without rapid testing in wide distribution, we've missed out on a critical medium-term tool, Mr. Speaker. And the Minister of Finance in her speech seems to realize that she's putting the economy on hold. She'll say, we'll rebuild the economy once COVID is beaten. Well, Mr. Speaker, rapid tests could help preserve the economy, and the vaccine will help us beat it. This government is late and has no plan for both. Canadians should see that off the start. This year has been a very difficult year for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We all know that. 2020 will be remembered as the year a global pandemic came to our shores and took this government completely by surprise, despite many departments warning them for months. It will be remembered as a year of foreclosures, rising unemployment and uncertainty. Worse, for 12,000 Canadian families, it will be remembered as a year of grief and tragedy. Cette année a été difficile pour tous, des plus jeunes aux plus âgés. On va se souvenir d'elle comme étant l'année de la pandémie qui a pris ce gouvernement par surprise. C'est une année de fermeture d'entreprises et de chômage. Mais pire encore, c'est une année de tristesse pour les presque 2000 familles canadiennes qui ont perdu un être cher. Mais les Canadiens ont montré du courage. Ils ont respecté les consignes et ont aidé les petites entreprises. Ils ont été là pour tous leurs amis et leurs familles. Through it all, Canadians have shown courage and fortitude. They've respected directives from our health authorities. But Canadians are hurting. Canadians want their lives back. And this fall economic statement shows that they cannot rely on the Liberal government to get their lives back. Canadians are not difficult people, Mr. Speaker. They have complied, followed rules. They've tightened their belts. They're reassuring their worried children and taking care of aged parents. And to this effect, I'm really glad the Liberal government and the minister took my proposal from this spring on support for parents by boosting the Canada child benefit. There it was on page 10 of my leadership platform, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so glad the Liberal cabinet was reading it just as hundreds of thousands of Conservative members were. Yes, I'm glad, Mr. Speaker, because this was a concrete proposal to help families, especially moms, working moms, juggling it all, helping families through the toughest time in our modern history. But we know that Canadians need more. As I said, Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker, and they've only asked one thing from this government, one simple thing. What is the plan, Mr. Speaker? For widespread use of rapid tests, what is the plan for rolling out the vaccine? When does it arrive? Who gets it first? Do we have the freezers for the -70 vaccine, Mr. Speaker? A robust portfolio in 2023 doesn't help us as we enter 2021. Well, Mr. Speaker, this fall economic statement answers the question on whether there is a plan. And it answers that no, there is not. And as the red ink on our balance sheet turns a dark crimson, we're facing a $399 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker, not $400 billion. It's a bit like 1999. You're not spending $20, Mr. Speaker. It's only $399 billion. Mr. Speaker. And Canadians know that not even half of that went to the emergency program. This government is not providing a plan, they're not providing clarity, and it's clear, having been late on rapid tests on the border, there's no clarity or competence. Où est le plan, monsieur? Il y a des millions de Canadiens qui sont oubliés par les libéraux. Et tout ce que ce gouvernement trouve à leur dire, c'est plus de dette, moins de jobs, pas de vaccins. Toute la population n'y a pas accès. Quand est-ce qu'on va recevoir des vaccins? Qui va être vacciné en priorité? L'annonce d'aujourd'hui fait juste nous dire que le gouvernement improvise. Les Canadiens sont tannés de
Canadians are
l'incompétence
tired
et
of
d'une
the government's
réponse
incompetence
toujours
and of their
tardive.
always delayed
This economic
reactions.
statement is another disappointment. Is that all they've got to say to the thousands of unemployed workers left behind by mismanagement of this government? Is that all they have to offer to Chris Rigas, owner of the old Fire Hall restaurant in Niagara, who is struggling to get by because of restrictions? How does this statement help Rodney and Tina Grace, who've been working 7 days a week to keep their Best Western open in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia? 30% of the businesses in Surrey, British Columbia still don't qualify for the wage subsidy because of red tape and rules from this government. But most of their staff qualify for the CERB benefit. So guess which decision businesses are faced with. If this government spent half as much time meeting with real Canadians, small business owners, than they spend on photo ops, they would know that workers, small business owners, are asking for clarity. Canadians in a pandemic aren't asking them to ban single-use plastics. They're asking for details on when the vaccine gets here, how it's being distributed, how it's being preserved at -70. How can they save their aging parents from a senior's home or a hospital bed? Take this government seriously when we know how this all started, Mr. Speaker. Think about how much better off Canada would have been if the Liberals had not shut down the pandemic early warning system. They did that in 2019, Mr. Speaker, without any consultation with scientists or with opposition parties in Parliament. Canada, for 20 years, had the world's leading pandemic early warning detection unit. It had helped stem the advance of H1N1, Mr. Speaker, of Ebola in other parts of the world. Canadians were helping protect others. But this government's incompetence led to that department not helping Canadians, Mr. Speaker. You heard that right. This government preferred to shut that down and rely on open source data from China rather than intelligence work gathered by Canadian experts. As a result, we had zero warning of the incoming pandemic. In many ways, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government took the batteries out of our smoke detector. Le gouvernement libéral on était des girouettes sur les risques de contagion en personne et sur le port de masques. Mais les conservateurs ont été bons joueurs, Monsieur le Président. On a essayé de travailler avec le gouvernement en tant que possible. On a essayé d'améliorer leur réponse erratique. Surtout, on a été là pour aider les travailleurs qui en avaient vraiment besoin. On a voté en faveur des mesures d'urgence et en faveur de programmes pour leur venir en aide. Mais le leadership du Premier ministre, c'était de dire aux gens de se mettre sur la PCE au lieu d'aider les travailleurs à garder leur job.
Rather than to help workers keep their jobs. You really have to live in an ivory tower
que les
to
Canadiens
think
aiment
that that's
cette
what
solution,
Canadians
Monsieur
really
le
want.
Président. Les gens veulent
Canadians want to
travailler,
go to work,
pas
Mr.
attendre
Speaker.
des chèques
They
du
don't want to
gouvernement.
sit home waiting for government
truth is,
checks.
This economic response has been erratic and confused at every step. Do you wonder why the Liberal government underspent on their own estimates for the wage subsidy by tens of billions of dollars while overspending on the CERB by tens of millions of dollars? They didn't have a plan to preserve the economy amid the storm of the pandemic. Millions more Canadians were put on the CERB than necessary when their jobs could have been maintained easily through an effective and swift wage subsidy. Cette approche illustre parfaitement la différence entre le Parti libéral
This approach
et le Parti
illustrates perfectly
conservateur.
the difference
Les
between
libéraux
the
croient
Liberal
que
Party and the
quand Ottawa a
Conservative
tous les
Party.
réponses,
The
elle doit
Liberals
donner
believe that
des
Ottawa
ordres.
has all the
Nous
answers
croyons
and
que
must
les
give
mesures
orders.
meilleures
We believe
solutions
that the
arrivent
best solutions
quand
come
Ottawa
when
travaille
Ottawa
en partenariat
works in
avec les gens
partnership
sur le
with
terrain.
people on the ground.
Un partenaire,
A partner,
pas un paternaliste,
not a
comme avec le
paternalistic
Premier ministre.
one, as with the
Mais
Prime
si au
Minister.
moins les libéraux avaient un
But
plan
if
clair.
only the Liberals had a clear
Ce qu'on
plan.
attend aujourd'hui, c'est un gouvernement
What
en
we're hearing
panique
today is a
qui brûle
panicked
de l'argent
government
pour
burning
cacher
money
son
to
incompétence.
hide its incompetence.
C'est inacceptable.
This is unacceptable.
Les Canadiens
Canadians
méritent mieux.
deserve better.
From my experience, Mr. Speaker, in both the military and in business, I know you have to learn from setbacks and failures. We must strive for excellence in what we do and promote an approach of continuous improvement. Teams do that. Businesses do that. Charities do that. Why does the Liberal government not do that? They haven't even learned from what they got wrong or slow in the first wave of the pandemic. We were last in line on rapid tests, Mr. Speaker, and now we're virtually last many this year, and we can't even get answers from this government on whether we have the logistics to receive it. The job of government in a crisis is to provide certainty, confidence in citizens that are worried, Mr. Speaker. We must provide a plan, clarity, stability, competence for those who rely on us. The upheaval we're seeing in our country lately is in large part because of the misguided measures of this government. Late on the border, late with programs, late with rapid tests, and now late with vaccines. While the Prime Minister prefers to compare himself to the worst student in the class when it comes to the spread of COVID-19, I want Canada to strive to be the best, Mr. Speaker. That's what Canadians expect. Unfortunately, we are far from that right now. After the ongoing rapid test debacle, and this week, Canadians are learning, even today, the Minister, in response to her speech, won't let us know which month next year vaccines will first start arriving. Our government had the duty to learn from its errors in the first wave, but instead of that, it's failed to provide vaccines for Canadians. At the same time, we'll be seeing vaccines roll out with all our allies. The Prime Minister has played the victim card. He said his government was helpless, that Canada didn't have the capability to manufacture vaccines. Now, not only is that, and it also doesn't explain why millions of people from Indonesia to Brazil will be receiving the vaccine before Canada will be. Again, the truth is the Liberal government was slow to respond, and they made a critical and in sadly some cases fatal error to put all their eggs in a basket. The government has been scrambling to catch up, and they don't want anyone to know that they're months behind other countries. As I said earlier, countries with 2.7 billion people will be served before Canada. This means we're near the back of the line. While Americans are talking about mass vaccination throughout all of January, our government is only speculating about getting part of our population vaccinated by September. That means 10 extra months, Mr. Speaker, of health risks for Canadians, business closures, and economic uncertainty. Canadians want their lives back, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health talks a great deal about the whole of government effort and the robust portfolio, but there's only one way to describe the performance of this government when it comes to vaccines: incompetent, Mr. Speaker. Canadians, in the midst of the second wave, would rather have one dose of the vaccine in the next month than the largest portfolio 18 months from now, Mr. Speaker. Ce gouvernement libéral n'inspire pas confiance.
This Liberal government does not inspire confidence. Let's talk about its purchase of $370 million for medical gowns paid to a company with almost zero experience. Or
de
their $237 million respirator contract to their friend
Le
Frank
scandale de We
Baylis.
Charity a révélé des
The
amis
We
libéraux
Charity scandal revealed
essaient de profiter
liberal friends who are
durant
trying to
une pandémie.
profit during a
Et à un
pandemic.
moment où la confiance des
And
citoyens
at a
est
time
tellement
when
importante,
the trust of citizens is so
les libéraux
important,
continuent d'utiliser
the
leur
liberals
liste de
continue to use their
donateurs pour
donor
choisir
list
des
to
futurs
choose
juges.
future judges.
C'est un scandale après l'autre,
It's one
Monsieur
scandal
le
after
Président.
another, Mr. Speaker.
Incertitude, manque de focus, des
Uncertainty,
dépenses
lack of
énormes,
focus,
traitement
huge
spécial pour leurs
expenses,
amis
special
et une
treatment for their
disconnexion
friends,
de la
and
réalité des Canadiens.
disconnection from
Ce
the
sont
reality
les
of
seuls
Canadians.
moyens
Those are
de
the
décrire ce
only ways
gouvernement.
to describe this government.
Mais les dégâts sont réels.
But the damage is
Il
real.
y a des millions
There
de gens
are millions
The economy was already showing serious signs of weakness before the pandemic hit. Ignoring our warnings, the Liberals took pride in running large structural deficits and raising taxes in good economic times. Ideological policies opposed by the entire country, like Bill C-69, tanker bans, pipeline cancellations, bad trade deals, and the inability to negotiate tariff avoidance has resulted in $160 billion leaving Canada before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. Within 2 weeks of one another, a great Canadian company, Tech, canceled a $60 billion project for our GDP out west, and the world's most famous investor, Warren Buffett, pulled out billions from a project in the east. There were already signs being sent by this Prime Minister that Canada was not open to job creation or investment. At a time we need it, Mr. Speaker, it will take a change in government to change that sign for the world, Mr. Speaker. In British Columbia, we've seen half a dozen sawmills close, and our aluminum smelter in Kitimat, one of the greenest operations in the world of its kind, they were left out to dry in both NAFTA and aluminum tariffs. Canada was already at a crossroads under the Liberals, Mr. Speaker, before the pandemic, and they are setting this country up to, for the first time in our history, pass on to our children a country with less opportunity and more division, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I want to prove it. The middle-class values that myself and many of our colleagues were raised with, Mr. Speaker, mine in Bowmanville, Ontario, taught me to work hard, help my neighbors, and strive to be the best I could be. I was taught to learn from setbacks, never accept failure, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and get better. This led me to serve 12 years in the Canadian Armed Forces alongside some of the most exceptional Canadian citizens around. It also led me to respect the value of hard work and perseverance and the nobility in work itself, Mr. Speaker. My first job was as a dishwasher and a short order cook, Mr. Speaker, in high school. And my last job before the military was with TransCanada, inspecting pipelines, back at a time before this government when that company was still proud to have Canada in its name, Mr. Speaker. I respect people, my colleagues do, that work hard to provide for their family, whether they're a uniformed and unionized plant worker business in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. There's a nobility in that act of discipline, perseverance, and working hard for your family. We cannot lose that in this country, Mr. Speaker. We will fight hard to ensure that we never lose touch with that fundamental value upon which Canadian society has been built. Je crois que c'est mon devoir d'être partenaire
I
pour les
believe it is my
provinces et
duty
les
to be a
Premières
partner
Nations.
for the
Je vais
provinces
être
and
un
First
champion
Nations.
des
I
petites
want to be a
entreprises
champion
et
for small
des
business
organismes à
and
but non
non-profit
lucratif. Je
organizations.
crois en l'immense
I
potentiel
believe
de
in the
notre
immense
énergie
potential
canadienne,
of our
de notre
Canadian
bois d'œuvre
energy, our
et de nos
lumber,
minéraux.
and our
Nous
minerals.
produisons l'énergie la
We
plus
produce
éthique
the most
et la plus
ethical and
environnementale au
environmentally
monde.
friendly
Et nous
energy in
voulons
the
un plus
world.
grand
And we want greater engagement with First Nations to develop that energy. Reconciliation must be more than just talk, Mr. Speaker. It's not just about looking at the mistakes of the past that brings lasting pride and wealth to communities that are too often forgotten. The James Bay Cree and the Huron-Wendat in Quebec are an example for all of Canada.
We need to get this country working again, Mr. Speaker. Hard work emboldens the soul and builds a nation. Hard work helps families. Those families build communities and make us proud to be Canadian. Just think of Jacqueline and Barbara's 7 rooms home decor and gifts in Ocean Park, British Columbia. They bought the store just before COVID, Mr. Speaker. It's been extra tough for businesses like that. But Jacqueline and Barbara persevered, worked harder, rebranded, and they recently reopened. Congratulations, Jacqueline and Barbara. That is the Canadian spirit. They don't want more debt saddling the next generation. They just want an opportunity. They could have packed it in, but they didn't. They stayed open, they adapted, they persevered. When I questioned the Minister of Finance in the House on behalf of energy workers in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, she boasted about how many people she'd put on the CERB in that province. Albertans especially, but Canadians don't want the CERB, Mr. Speaker. They want the ability to get their lives back and to get back to work. They want a government that helps them build their livelihood in their communities rather than pushing them to close shop and move away. Mr. Speaker, those who love their trade, their pursuit, and are loyal to local businesses versus those who the government wants to flock to a trendy job that is in no way connected to the community or the betterment of our country. And while this Prime Minister seems to think that every Canadian can simply work on their laptop from the local cafe, Mr. Speaker, that's not reality. Nor is it what Canadians want. Conservatives are here to fight for those who build things in Canada, those who get their hands dirty and take pride in doing a job well before they come home for the night. And whether they're pulling the resources out of the ground in Canada or pulling resources out of their brain educated in Canada, we need to applaud and help them do that, Mr. Speaker. That's why we were hoping for a plan for rapid tests, for vaccine. Unlike this finance minister, I don't want the economy to crash and be rebuilt after the pandemic. I want to save it and make sure it's stronger after the pandemic. So we are here, Mr. Speaker, for the manufacturers, the aluminum and steel industry, the small business owner, the first-generation Canadian that started a business and now hire and employ 7 other families. We're here for the farmers and the commercial fishermen, Mr. Speaker. We're here for the Indigenous entrepreneur, the working mom and dad juggling childcare and the ability to get on the GO train to go into work in the city. We're here for those Canadians that want their lives back, that want the ability to work hard and want the ability to pass on to their children a Canada that is limitless in its potential, Mr. Speaker. And they deserve a government with a vision like that, not a government that is late at every step in the worst year in our modern history. Les travailleurs canadiens méritent un gouvernement qui se bat pour eux.
Canadian workers deserve a government that fights for them. A government that is not obsessed with transitioning our industries in the midst of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. A government that is patriotic and not afraid to fight on the world stage for rapid access to vaccines. A government that knows that Canada has an identity, a history,
être
and that we can be
fiers.
proud of this.
This crisis and the rebuilding from it will take grit. It will take determination, perseverance, bold decision, but most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will take a plan to chart our course forward. That's why it's so disappointing. After a record period without a budget, there's a stealth budget introduced today with no plan, Mr. Speaker. COVID has set us back, but COVID will not stop us. With the right ideas, with principled, ethical leaders who understand the value of a job, whether it's your first job out of school, Mr. Speaker, or your last job before retirement. With a government that will put the prosperity of all Canadians ahead of the special interests of a select few. If we have a government, that's the mission of my colleagues with me here today, Mr. Speaker, and that must be our country's mission. And that's why I'm so disappointed with the Finance Minister's update today. There's no vision. There is no expression of values, including the value inherent in working Canadians. And the lack of a plan to address the most critical issues facing our country in one of the most challenging years in our country's history will only fuel the fears and uncertainties facing Canadian families across this great country. Mr. Speaker, now is not the time for experiments. Now is the time for experience. Now is not the time for building back with slogans. Now is the time we show we have our citizens' backs, Mr. Speaker. We need to have a plan for the challenges we face today so that our children will have the same opportunities we did tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the Leader of the Official Opposition started off by talking what will Canada be remembered by, or the government be remembered by in 2020. And I believe what the Canadians are going to remember is that a year of a crisis of a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, that the Government of Canada stepped up in a very real and tangible way, and worked with the provinces and territories, Indigenous leaders, the very many organizations, non-profits, private sector, and came together and recognized that we needed to minimize the negative impact of the coronavirus. And by that working together, we were able to make a difference. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Leader of the Official Opposition, does he not agree that it is the efforts by working together collaboratively that Canada has been very successful to date and will continue to be going forward, because we have the right approach in terms of
Position.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Liberal Deputy House Leader. The only collaboration I saw in the remarks today, Mr. Speaker, was the fact that the Finance Minister did adopt the child care plan I advanced last spring, Mr. Speaker. In the spirit of Team Canada, I was a little upset she didn't thank me for the suggestions, Mr. Speaker. But if it's good for Canadian families, I'm happy with that knowledge alone. But he started off by saying, what will Canadians remember the most politically amidst the pandemic? I think on this side of the House, what we will remember most, and what a lot of Canadians will remember most, and be most disappointed with, that even in a pandemic, with no parliamentary oversight, there was one special line for Liberal insiders and one other line for all other Canadians. There was the We Charity scandal that they prorogued the House and have had a cover-up of historic proportions rather than answer reasonable questions about, and sole source contracts for a former Liberal MP colleague of theirs whose seat was hardly cold from having sat in this House before he got untendered contracts that the government has tried to mislead Canadians about, saying it's with another company, even though the name of the respirator is the Frank Baylis respirator. So I think that's one of the disappointing things I'll remember, rather than the Team Canada, where some of us even offered to sit on an all-party pandemic response team.
Au lieu de faire appel à
There was
l'opposition
one line
qui
for
se
liberal
proposait
insiders
pour
and one line for all
siéger sur
Canadians.
toutes sortes
On
de
this side, we're going to
comités,
fight for all Canadians.
le gouvernement
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Repentigny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Alors, le chef de l'opposition
The leader of
officielle
the
il a
official
écrit de plusieurs
opposition
suggestions et
made a
conseils
number
au
of
gouvernement
suggestions
pour ce qu'il aurait
and
dû faire et pour ce
concessions
qu'il
to the
devrait
government
faire dans
about
le
what it
futur.
should
Alors,
do,
j'aimerais
what it has done
l'entendre
and should do in the
sur
future.
une
I'd like to
mesure qui est
hear
mise
what
de
he
l'avant
has
par
to
le Bloc
say about
québécois
something
pour
the
peut-être
Bloc
arriver à
has
réduire le déficit,
proposed
soit
to reduce
de
the
couper
deficit
dans toutes les
potentially, and that
subventions, les
is to
crédits
cut
d'impôt et dans
all
tout l'argent public qui
subsidies
est mis
and
pour
tax
les énergies
credits
fossiles.
for fossil fuels.
Honorable chef de
The Honourable
l'Opposition.
Leader of the Opposition.
Merci pour la question, Monsieur le
Thank you for the
Président.
question,
Nous
Mr.
sommes
Speaker.
ici pour tous
We
les
are
Canadiens et
here on
tous
behalf of all
les
Canadians
Québécois et
and all
Québécoises,
Quebecers,
Monsieur le Président.
Mr.
Je
Speaker.
suis fier de
I
nos
am
travailleurs
proud
locaux dans les régions
our
du
work
Québec, Monsieur
in
le
the
Président,
regions of
dans le
Quebec,
Saguenay, à
in the
Abitibi.
Saguenay,
Je suis
in
fier de
Abitibi.
nos ressources
I'm proud
naturelles
of our natural
les plus
resources,
éco-responsables
some
au
of the
monde,
most
Monsieur le
environmentally responsible
C'est
in the
pourquoi,
world.
en pleine
Mr. Speaker.
pandémie,
And that's why,
c'est le temps pour
in
les
the midst
emplois.
of a
Pour
pandemic,
tous les Québécois
it's
et
time
Québécois.
for jobs
La
for
création
all
de
Quebecers
richesses,
and the
Monsieur le
creation
Président.
of wealth,
L'opportunité
Mr. Speaker.
pour tout le monde.
Opportunities for
J'ai
all.
parlé de ça dans ma
I
réunion
talked
avec
about that
Premier
at
ministre
my
Legault.
meeting with Premier
Je vais
Legault.
être un partenaire
I want to be a partner
avec l'Assemblée nationale,
with the National
pas un
Assembly,
paternaliste comme le Premier
not a
ministre.
paternalist like the
Et c'est
Prime
le temps
Minister.
pour les
And it's
Québécois et
time
Québécois
for
de
Quebecers
réexaminer
to
le Parti conservateur,
examine
Monsieur le
the
Président,
Conservative Party, to
parce
take
que
another
nous
look
sommes ici
at
pour le
us,
bien-être
because we are
de tous les
here
Canadiens.
for the benefit of
Nous
all
sommes ici
Canadians.
pour protéger
We are
le
here
français
to protect
à
French
Montréal
in
et à
Montreal
travers le pays.
and all
Nous
across the
sommes
country.
prêts d'être le
We
prochain
are
gouvernement, Monsieur le
prepared
Président,
to be the next
et les Québécois et
government, Mr.
Québécoises
Speaker,
méritent
and
mieux.
Quebecers deserve better.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments. The honourable member for New Westminster
Honorable député de
Burnaby.
New Westminster Burnaby.
Mr. Speaker, I know the member
Merci,
is a
Monsieur le
student of
Président.
history. He
Je
knows
sais que
through
mon
the
collègue est
previous
un,
crises, we've had strict
grand
laws against
partisan de
excess
l'histoire.
profit, strict laws against
Il
profiteering.
sait que par
And
le
yet,
passé,
in
nous
this
avions
pandemic,
des lois
Canada's
pour éviter les
billionaires
profits
have added to their wealth by the tune of
démesurés.
over
Pourtant, pendant la
$53 billion
pandémie,
so
les
far.
milliardaires
Now, the
canadiens
papers
ont
that the government has
accru leur
distributed
richesse de
today
plus de
indicate
53 milliards
that
de
what they
dollars.
intend to do eventually
Et
is to
que le gouvernement
withdraw
nous a
supports
annoncé
from people.
aujourd'hui,
But the
c'est-
people tax, there's no excess
Or, dans ce
profits
plan,
tax.
il n'y a aucun plan
The web
de-
giants who have made
d'imposition
billions
de la
of dollars
richesse.
through this pandemic are not obliged to pay $1
les grandes
of corporate
entreprises
tax.
qui
Would the member agree with us? That
ont
what
fait
needs
des
to happen
profits records
is
pendant cette
this
pandémie
government
ne paient
needs to take a
aucune
strong stand against the excess profits and
imposition
put in place
sur,
on the revenue side the
leurs
kinds of
revenus.
things that
Donc,
would make
mon
a
collègue
difference
est-il d'accord
so that
qu'il
people
faut
can get the
imposer
supports that they so
les
desperately need.
profits des grandes entreprises
Leader
pour
of the
aider les
opposition.
Canadiens et les
Thank
Canadiennes
you
qui
very
en ont
much,
besoin.
Mr. Speaker.
Alors,
I
le
know
chef de
my friend
l'opposition.
from New
Merci, Monsieur
Westminster
le Président.
Burnaby
Je
is
sais que mon
addressing
collègue de
questions to
New
the leader of the
Westminster
Conservative Party.
Burnaby
I'm the
adresse
wrong
une
person
question
to
au
suggest we need
chef
to
du
raise
Parti
taxes to,
conservateur,
Mr.
mais
Speaker.
bon,
In
je
fact, we
suis
need
mal
to
placé
probably
pour dire
provide
que
some relief to
nous
small
allons
businesses and
augmenter
seniors who are struggling.
les impôts. Je pense qu'il faut plutôt
The
alléger le
problem
fardeau
is
des
then that
petites
member finds
entreprises.
it every day in question period. There are 4 parties on the extreme left of the political spectrum in
Mon
Canada
collègue
right
le
now.
démontre à tous les jours. Il y a
His
4
declining
partis
party,
à l'extrême
the Liberal
gauche
government,
de
the
l'échelle
Green Party,
politique. Qu'un
to
seul
right,
parti qui soit au
la
centre,
gauche
au
radicale.
centre-droit.
The
There's
radical
only
left.
Il n'y a
Mr.
qu'un
Speaker,
seul parti,
in the
Monsieur le Président, qui soit
center-right,
au centre,
fighting for working
centre-droite,
Canadians.
qui travaille pour
I'd
les
invite that
Canadiens.
members,
J'invite
union members in his riding, take a
les
look at the only party
syndicalistes dans sa
that supports
circonscription
building
de
things in
voir
Canada,
quel est le
supports getting our
parti qui
energy and our
appuie la
resources to market,
construction
Mr.
au
Speaker.
Canada, qui
And when
appuie
it comes to some
le
of
fait
the,
de
the corporate
permettre à
excesses,
nos
Mr.
ressources de se
Speaker,
rendre au marché.
I've been calling out that
Et
too,
pour ce
but
qui est des
I
excès du
prefer
marché privé,
caveat emptor,
je le
Mr.
dénonce
Speaker.
aussi.
Buyer beware.
Mais je pense
We
qu'il
should
faut
look at what grocery
miser
chains
sur la
are squeezing
responsabilisation. Il faut
suppliers
voir quelles
when
sont les
that's one
chaînes
of the only
d'épicerie qui
sectors that have seen record profits
font
amid
des
the
profits
pandemic. I
records
think
et qui
Canadians
imposent des
want to
frais
support
supplémentaires aux
small
Canadiens. Je
local
pense que
businesses,
les
suppliers that
Canadiens
respect
veulent
local
appuyer les
farmers, local
petites et moyennes
producers, aren't
entreprises les
squeezing them, Mr.
producteurs
Speaker.
locaux
So
qui ne
we
leur
don't
imposent pas
apply
des
big
frais
government,
exorbitants.
but we will
Nous
call
n'allons
out,
pas
particularly in a time of
être un
crisis, what we
gouvernement
think is not
excessif. Nous allons
appropriate corporate
dénoncer ce qui
conduct.
est
And I'm very proud
inacceptable,
of our
bien
Shadow
sûr, mais je
Minister
suis
of
très
Agriculture,
fier
Mr.
de
Speaker.
notre ministre du
After
cabinet
her
Fantôme
efforts,
pour
we suddenly
l'agriculture
see
qui,
this government
après tous ses
respond
efforts,
both
a vu le
on the
gouvernement
grocery issue
lui
and my
répondre
colleagues
sur la
from across
question
Quebec
des
on the
épiceries
compensation
et mes collègues du Québec
for our
sur
farmers, Mr.
la
Speaker,
compensation
promised
pour nos
years ago
agriculteurs qui a
and
été
held up.
promise il y a des années.
So not only are we opposing as the official
Donc,
opposition,
comme
Mr. Speaker,
opposition
we're
officielle,
proposing
nous ne
and
faisons
we're
pas
proposing to
qu'opposer,
get
nous
Canada back on
proposons
track
des
and build our
mesures
country
pour la relance
back
économique
stronger.
canadienne, pour une relance économique plus forte.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for
L'honorable
Nanaimo,
député
Lady
de
Smith.
Nanaimo, Lady Smith.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and
Merci,
I'd like to
Monsieur le
thank the
Président.
honourable
Je tiens à
member for
remercier
his
l'honorable
speech.
député pour son discours.
I know that he says that he
Bon,
supports
je sais que mon
climate
collègue
action
dit
and
qu'il
dealing
appuie
with
les actions
the climate
climatiques
emergency
et la
that
lutte
we all
à
voted that we
l'urgence
were in last year.
climatique sur laquelle
And
nous
I'd
nous
like
sommes
to ask
prononcés
him
l'année
about the
dernière.
proposal that the
Mais
Liberals have.
j'aimerais
It's
savoir
straight
si
out
la
of
proposition
the Green
des
Party
libéraux
documents
qui
about creating a national
provient du Parti
energy
vert de
grid to
créer
tie the provinces together,
réseau
and noting that there was a
énergétique national
geyser
pour relier
that
les
they
provinces
hit
les
for geothermal in
unes aux autres.
Saskatchewan that
Et
could put lots of
il y a d'ailleurs
former
une
oil
usine de
drillers to
géothermie
work,
en Saskatchewan qui pourrait
transferring their
embaucher
skills as we
plusieurs
work through a
travailleurs du
just
secteur
transition
pétrolier
and make sure
gazeux dans
that
cette
those workers
transition juste et
have good paying jobs as we
équitable
work
pour
towards
trouver de
the
bons emplois
energy
pour
future and leave the
l'avenir
fossil era
énergétique de
behind.
notre pays,
And I just
pour
wonder what he
tourner le
thinks
dos à
about this
l'époque
proposal that the
des
Liberals have
énergies
put
fossiles.
forward
Donc je me demande ce
and
que mon
what
collègue
his
pense de
ideas
cette
are
proposition
in terms of
libérale
clean, green